Sometimes, the most powerful part of a story is not in what is spoken, but in what is left unsaid. Among the native tribes, silence was more than absence. It was a language, a way of holding secrets too sacred for daylight. Tonight, you will walk gently into that silence, following Ahio, a young apprentice who learns that taboos are not prisons, but doors into the hidden heart of her people. There is nothing to fear here. The river will murmur softly, the fire will glow low, and each whisper you hear will only carry you further into rest. Let the rhythm of this tale lull you, like footsteps in the dark, until your own thoughts loosen and drift. By the end, the silence will not only belong to Ahio, it will be yours, cradling you into sleep. The river had always been Ahio's first teacher. Long before she learned the chants of her people, before she was allowed to grind herbs in the healer's bowl or weave reeds into mats, she would sit at its edge and listen. The river spoke in tones that shifted with the hours, a hushed lull in the morning, a restless babble at dusk, a deep secretive murmur in the night. No one else seemed to lean in the way she did. To the others, water was life, drink, fish, cleansing. To her, it was a language. The elders warned that rivers carried memory. If you whispered a name into the current, it would travel far and might return in dreams. The children laughed at this, daring one another to shout their secret crushes or the name of a rival into the water. But Ahio noticed how the adults never played such games. When her uncle died, his name was never spoken again, as though it had dissolved into the current itself. Even the most talkative women lowered their voices at the riverbank, as if afraid that careless words might be swept away and return twisted. At night, when the village slept, Ahio liked to imagine the river holding all the things that could not be said aloud. It shimmered under the moon like a long, dark mirror. When she stared at it too long, she saw not her own face but shadows of others, a pair of eyes she did not recognize, the curve of a jaw that seemed too old or too far away to belong to her. Once she thought she heard a voice call her name, not with the clarity of a shout, but like someone breathing against her ear from another world. She froze, heart pounding, and only the endless murmur of water remained. The people spoke often of bravery in hunting, of skill in war, of endurance in the face of hunger. But what no one said aloud was that silence was its own kind of endurance. To carry what could not be spoken, that was a burden heavier than a spear. Ahio began to realize that every adult she knew walked with secrets stitched into their shadows, never shown in daylight. The river carried those burdens invisibly, reflecting only the surface. She returned there again and again, seeking answers that never came in words. Sometimes she dipped her hand into the current, letting the chill sting her skin, as though the water itself might inscribe its truth onto her body. But the river only whispered back in 1,000 tongues. It promised nothing, revealed nothing, and yet left her certain that some doorway was waiting, a threshold woven not of wood or stone, but of silence itself. On the far edge of the village stood the tent that no boy dared approach. Its hides were dyed with the deep red of berries and clay, a color that seemed to throb even in shadow. The red tent, they called it, though no one explained what it meant. To the boys, it was a place of fear, whispered about as though monsters might dwell inside. To Ahio as a child, it was a puzzle, a dwelling both ordinary and forbidden, always seeming fuller on the nights when the moon was brightest. Only as she grew did she understand. It was the place where women retreated when their blood came, the time of moon cycles that marked them apart. Men were not allowed near, and even brothers averted their gaze as their sisters crossed the threshold. The rules were sharp. Food was delivered to its entrance, but never handed indirectly. No man's shadow was allowed to fall across its door. And yet sometimes, Ahio heard laughter ripple from within, or the haunting hum of a chant that never left the hides. It was not shame that lived inside, but something far stranger, far older. When her own time arrived, Ahio entered with trembling legs. The interior was heavy with scents, burning sage, sweetgrass, dried petals, and beneath it all the metallic tang of blood, faint but unignorable. The air was thick, warm, and close, almost like entering another body. Women sat in a circle, their faces calm, their voices low. One of the elders wrapped her in soft deerskin, and the weight of it pressed her shoulders as if to say, "You belong to us now, in this hidden current of womanhood." That night, she listened as the older women whispered of things never spoken outside. They spoke of the pain of desire, of bodies that longed in ways men would never admit existed. They spoke of spirits who hovered closest during bleeding days, drawn by the scent of life being shed. They spoke of power too dangerous to be seen openly, power that was veiled in taboo not because it was evil, but because it was too immense to be touched carelessly. For the first time, Ahio understood that a taboo was not a wall. It was a doorway disguised, waiting for those brave enough to cross. Lying on the furs, her body aching, she felt both small and vast. Outside the red tent, men sharpened spears and boasted of hunts. Inside, a different strength pulsed quietly, older than war, older than words. Ahio closed her eyes and felt the rhythm of her blood echo the rhythm of the earth itself. She was no longer only herself. She was part of a lineage of hidden voices, carried forward in silence, like the river carrying names it could never speak aloud. There were words that lived only in thought, never in the mouth. Ahio had learned this as early as she had learned to walk. When her cousin drowned one summer, his name was swallowed by the river, and no one dared utter it again. His toys remained in the dust, untouched. His mother wept silently but never called him back, not even in sleep. In the village, it was said that to speak the name of the dead was to pull their spirit from its path, to drag them like fish caught in a net, restless and half alive. For a child, it was a strange lesson. How could something as light as sound carry such danger? But Ahio felt the truth of it each time she longed to whisper her cousin's name in secret. It was a hunger in her chest, to call him back, to test if the world would tremble at the syllables. Yet each time she opened her lips, a weight fell in her throat, and the word refused to rise. It was as though the silence itself guarded the boundary, heavy as a hand pressing against her mouth. The elders told her stories instead. They spoke of wandering spirits who returned because someone called them carelessly, voices that entered dreams and refused to leave. They told her of a woman who once sang her dead husband's name during the planting season, and in the night her tent filled with the smell of rot. The next morning, the corn shoots withered in the ground. Ahio listened, wide-eyed, torn between disbelief and awe. Was the silence superstition, or was it a fragile thread holding the world together? As she grew older, she began to notice how grief shaped itself in quietness. Women carried loss in their hands, men carried it in the stiffness of their shoulders, but no one carried it in words. Instead, grief became rhythm, the pounding of drums at a feast, the weaving of new patterns into a belt, the long, wordless gaze across the fire. Each act seemed to speak what the lips could not. Ahio began to understand that silence was not emptiness. It was another language, one that shaped the living as much as the dead. Still, she could not rid herself of temptation. Sometimes, lying by the river, she whispered half a name into her breath, so low even her own ears could barely catch it. Nothing happened, and yet she felt the air grow colder, her skin rise in goose flesh, as though unseen eyes had turned toward her. That fear, sharp and electrifying, taught her the deepest truth of all. Taboos do not need proof to hold power. They live because people breathe them into silence, again and again, until the silence itself becomes a presence. It was said that to grow into an adult, one must pass through fire and pain. The hunters and warriors carried scars like necklaces, each mark a memory of survival. Yet these scars were not born only in battle. They were carved deliberately, in ceremonies that most spoke of only in fragments. The trials of flesh were secrets handed down by fathers to sons, by uncles to nephews, but never discussed outside the circle. To the uninitiated, they were whispered of with both pride and dread. Ahio learned of them not by being told, but by listening to the muffled cries at night, when boys disappeared into the woods with their elders. Sometimes they returned with arms bound in fresh cuts, or with chest muscles punctured and strung with cords that hung them from wooden poles until their bodies trembled and their spirits drifted. The next day, their eyes seemed far away, unfocused, as though they had seen something no words could contain. Women did not ask questions. The men never explained. The scars alone became the story. The healer with whom Ahio trained carried such marks, pale and raised across his chest. She once dared to ask about them, and he smiled without warmth. "The body must be broken," he said softly, "so the spirit can pass through." Then he said no more, but his words lingered like smoke in her lungs. Was pain the only gate to wisdom? Was the spirit so stubborn it had to be forced from the body like sap squeezed from bark? She began to see pain differently after that. It was not merely suffering, but a currency, a language of passage. The boys who endured returned altered, walking with heavier silence, as if they carried a second self bound tightly to their ribs. Some grew proud, their laughter sharpened into boasts. Others grew quiet, shadows in their eyes. Whatever they saw, it stayed locked behind their silence, another secret folded into the fabric of the village. At times, Ahio pressed her palm against her own chest, imagining the pull of cords through her skin, the burning of flesh in ritual. She shuddered, but part of her longed to understand. Was this not another threshold, like the river, like the red tent? A hidden doorway that only pain could open? The thought both terrified and enticed her. In the night, she dreamed of dangling in the air, ribs straining, stars spinning above her. And always, a voice in the dark whispered, To suffer is to see. There were stories the fire never told aloud. Ahio had caught glimpses of them only in the quietest corners of the village. Two figures lingering longer than necessary after the hunt, a gaze that lingered on a body not meant for it, laughter that stopped abruptly when footsteps approached. Desire moved like smoke, curling into places it was not supposed to go, and in those hidden corners lived the lovers in the shadows. Among her people, marriage was often a matter of alliance, families joining for strength and survival. Yet Ahio noticed how affection rarely followed the path of arrangement. She saw women brushing against women in the weaving tent, their fingers lingering a little too long. She saw men resting hands on one another's shoulders, not in the rough way of warriors, but with tenderness quickly disguised as jest. These gestures were never spoken of, but she felt them as surely as she felt the river's current. The elders warned against speaking openly of such things. Every spirit is born with its path, they said, and to walk off the path is to invite the trickster to your door. Yet Ahio could not help but wonder, who decided where the path lay? Was it the spirits, or the silence of the living? She had once heard of the two spirits, people who carried both man and woman within them, revered by some, feared by others. The healer hinted at it once, his voice low, saying, "They walk closer to the spirits because they belong fully to neither side." Then he fell silent, as if the words themselves were dangerous. At night, lying in the red tent, Ahio heard the older women whisper their secrets. They spoke of lovers taken in secrecy, of warmth shared in silence, of desires too wild to tame. They laughed quietly, voices roughened by memory, and Ahio realized that passion had always lived hidden within the village, wrapped in silence like a flame smothered beneath a bowl. It was not absence. It was presence, forbidden from daylight. Once, she woke before dawn and walked near the river. There, in the shadows of the reeds, she saw two silhouettes pressed together, moving with urgency, with hunger. Their breath carried in broken whispers, their faces hidden from the moon. She turned away before they saw her, heart pounding. She did not feel fear, nor disgust, only the sense that she had glimpsed another of the village's great truths, one never sung in the chants, yet alive in every heartbeat, waiting to be carried in silence until the stars dissolved at dawn. The village told stories of victory with pride, but it never spoke fully of what happened after. Battles were sung in chants, hunts of men described as if they were hunts of deer. Yet when the warriors returned, their silence was heavier than their spears. Some carried scalps, dried and tied to their belts. Others returned with children or women taken from rival tribes. And sometimes one returned alone, with eyes clouded, refusing to speak at all. Ahio noticed the contradictions early. Warriors were celebrated, but whispers followed them. Some of the captives were adopted, given new names, and raised as kin. Others vanished, their presence dissolved into silence. No one ever said where they had gone, but Ahio had her suspicions. Around the fires, when the wind carried the smell of roasted meat, she sometimes caught a flicker in the eyes of the men, a shadow of something unspeakable, something primal that did not belong in words. The healer once told her that war was not only about killing, but about taking spirits. When you strike an enemy, he said, you do not only end his breath. You take his strength into your own, whether you want it or not. He never explained further, but Ahio heard rumors that some tribes consumed pieces of their enemies in ritual, believing the act would bind the dead's courage to the living. Whether her people did the same, she could never confirm. It was one of those truths no one admitted, yet everyone suspected. What could not be spoken weighed heavily on the children of warriors. Ahio once played with a boy who had been adopted from another tribe, his skin a shade different, his accent still carrying foreign edges. The others treated him as brother, but never let him forget his origin. His name was new, but in the silence of the night she heard him whisper an older one, soft and trembling, as if afraid the river might carry it back to the ears of ghosts. War left no tent unmarked. The men carried scars on their bodies, but the women carried them in silence, through the eyes of captives who became wives, through the weight of children who bore two bloodlines. And through it all, the village wove silence around these wounds, never naming them, never admitting their shape. Ahio understood then that victory was never clean, and that the greatest secrets of war were buried not in the earth, but in the silence of those who lived on. Dreams were supposed to be messages. That was what the elders said. A dream of deer meant abundance. A dream of fire meant change. A dream of drowning meant one's spirit wandered too far. But there were dreams no one dared confess. Ahio discovered this slowly, like stepping onto a path that curved into shadow. Her own dreams began to trouble her at the cusp of womanhood. She would see herself walking naked through the village, her skin painted with ash, and the eyes of the dead followed her from the trees. Other nights she dreamed of lying with someone faceless, their breath heavy against her throat, a hunger she could not name but that woke her trembling, thighs slick with sweat. Such dreams she kept buried, even from her closest companions, for she sensed instinctively that not all dreams were meant to be shared. One night, she dared to ask the healer if dreams could ever be dangerous. His eyes grew sharp. The spirits listen most when you are asleep, he said. If you dream of something forbidden, perhaps it is because the spirits wish to test whether you will carry it into waking. He left her with no comfort, only a sharper edge to her fear. Did her dreams belong to her at all, or were they snares set by unseen hands? But Ahio noticed she was not alone. She caught others in moments of shameful stillness, a boy staring too long into the fire, his body shifting restlessly, a girl who refused to sleep in the red tent, muttering that her dreams there left her hollowed. None of them spoke openly, but in their eyes she recognized the same secret weight. It was as though the village was haunted not by spirits alone, but by the unspoken desires that rode the dreams of its children. She began to wonder whether taboos were born in the body before they were named by the elders. What if the forbidden did not come from rules, but from within, bubbling up in night visions too raw to be voiced? That thought frightened her, because it meant the silence could never protect her completely. Even asleep, she was not safe from herself. The dead were everywhere, though no one admitted it. Their absence was loud, their silence heavy. The elders spoke of them only in ritual, when the drums beat slow and the smoke of cedar curled into the sky. Yet Ohio often felt their presence in the simplest of moments, in the cold draft that slid under her sleeping furs, in the sudden stillness of the forest when even the crickets paused. There was a belief she learned not from the elders, but from whispers among children. The dead could ride the breath of the living. If you inhaled too deeply at night, you risked drawing a spirit into your chest, letting it sit in your lungs like frost. That was why some slept with faces covered, why others muttered short chants before closing their eyes. Ohio laughed at this once, but the laughter soured the night she woke gasping, certain that someone's breath hovered just above her lips, though no one was there. Her grandmother confirmed it in her own way. She never spoke the names of the dead, but when Ohio asked why, the old woman pressed a finger to her own lips and whispered, "Because they listen. And once they hear, they follow." That warning sank into her skin like a stain. From then on, every breath in the dark carried weight. The red tent women sometimes spoke of the dead more openly, their voices low. They said that when blood flowed, the barrier between worlds thinned, and the spirits were hungriest. They cautioned the young not to weep too loudly, not to call out in longing, lest the dead mistake love for invitation. For Ohio, this was not merely fear, but intimacy, the sense that every silence she kept was also a conversation with those who had gone before. One night, she dreamt again of her drowned cousin. His face was pale, lips blue, but his eyes burned with a strange hunger. He leaned close and exhaled into her mouth, and she woke choking, her chest tight as though filled with water. She stumbled to the river, gasping, her lungs aching for air. Standing at the edge, she whispered nothing. For the first time, she truly understood the terror of naming, of breathing wrong, of letting the dead slip too close. From childhood, Ohio had watched the healer gather roots and leaves with care, his fingers stained with earth, his breath steady as if he spoke to the plants themselves. Most of his craft was open, teas for fevers, poultices for wounds, smoke to ease the breath. But Ohio sensed there were medicines not taught in daylight, herbs that never appeared in the lessons he gave to the young. She discovered the truth one dusk, when she followed him into the forest without asking. His steps were slow, deliberate, as though each patch of moss and each tree root was familiar. He knelt by a plant with sharp leaves and small white flowers, and when he cut its stem, a milky sap bled into his palm. She recognized it. The plant was said to be poisonous, deadly if swallowed. Yet he gathered it with reverence, wrapping it in bark as though it were treasure. Later that night, she crept to the edge of his tent and listened. A man's voice groaned inside, heavy with pain, broken by shallow breaths. The healer whispered chants not meant for children's ears, words that fell like stones into deep water. Then came silence, followed by a sound that froze Ahur's blood, the scraping of a knife, slow and deliberate, as if peeling away the skin of the world itself. The next morning, the man walked from the healer's tent pale but alive, his fever gone. No one asked what had been done, but Ohio noticed the faint scent of smoke and blood still clinging to him. She realized then that medicine was not always gentle. It was a knife as much as a balm, a secret pact between healer and patient that no one else was allowed to witness. From that day forward, she could not look at herbs without wondering what other faces they might wear in the dark. Healing was not only knowledge, but power, and power was always wrapped in silence. She felt a shiver of fear and longing. If she was to become a healer herself, would she one day learn those forbidden chants, wield those hidden knives? Or would she always remain at the edge, peering in at secrets never meant for her? Blood was life, everyone said, but there were times when blood became more than life. It became currency. Ahio first heard of the oath in hushed tones, children daring each other to nick their palms and press them together. But the elders warned sharply against such play. Blood was not to be mingled lightly. It was a rope, they said, binding souls so tightly that even death could not undo the knot. The truth of this came to her in fragments. She learned of hunters who bound themselves in brotherhood, their cuts pressed together until their veins pulsed as one. She learned of warriors who sealed their loyalty with wounds, believing that only shared blood could shield them in battle. And she heard darker whispers still, that some offered blood to spirits, spilling drops into the earth so the dead would carry their names with favor. It was during her time in the red tent that she witnessed it most clearly. An older woman, trembling with grief, pricked her own thigh and let the blood fall onto the packed earth. She murmured a name that no one else could hear, her voice cracked but steady. The others looked away, pretending not to notice, but Ahio saw the relief in the woman's shoulders after. It was as though she had given her sorrow to the ground, trading blood for silence. The healer once told her, though quickly, as if regretting it, that blood was the only language the spirits could not ignore. Smoke, song, offerings of food or trinkets could be brushed aside, but blood demanded attention. It was the one thing the dead and the living shared, the bridge between worlds. That was why it was dangerous. That was why it was sacred. Ahio began to understand that every cut carried more weight than pain. To bleed before others was to expose not just flesh, but soul. That night she lay awake, staring at her palm, wondering what secret might be bound within her blood, and who or what might be waiting to claim it. Hunger was not only an accident of poor hunting or harsh winter. Among Ahio's people, hunger could also be chosen, a weapon sharpened against the self, a ritual carried like fire in the belly. She first learned of this during the season when the young men prepared for vision quests. They vanished into the hills with nothing but a knife, a rattle, and the will to endure. For 4 days and nights, they refused food, sometimes even water, until their bodies thinned and their minds slipped beyond waking. When they returned, their faces were hollow, eyes glowing with a strange fever. Some carried visions they could recount in trembling words, an eagle that spoke in thunder, a deer whose eyes turned into stars, a woman of fire who promised strength in exchange for obedience. Others came back silent, their mouths sealed as though their visions were too dangerous to share. But all carried the mark of hunger in their bodies, ribs sharp, voices hoarse, movements slow as if walking through water. Ahio could not understand how starving could bring wisdom. She asked the healer once, and he answered without looking at her, "When the body is emptied, the spirits come closer. They are drawn to the hollow places." That answer haunted her. She lay awake imagining herself growing smaller, lighter, her belly a cave where voices echoed. What if hunger did not bring wisdom, but possession? What if the visions were not gifts, but intrusions? She tried it once in secret. For 2 days, she refused food, hiding her hunger behind excuses. At first, her stomach ached, twisting like a fist inside her. Then came the dizziness, the slow tremble in her legs. On the second night, she dreamed of standing at the edge of the river, her cousin's drowned body beside her, his lips moving without sound. When she leaned close to hear him, she awoke with a scream caught in her throat, her body slick with sweat, her mouth dry as bone. From then on, she understood that hunger was not merely suffering. It was a door that opened too easily. The question was never whether visions would come, but whether one could endure what they revealed. She thought of the boys who returned silent and broken, and she wondered if their silence was not strength, but survival. Perhaps hunger stripped the body only to reveal the shadow already waiting inside. If hunger hollowed the body from within, fire marked it from without. Scars were more than memories of accidents. They were chosen, inscribed deliberately, as if flesh were parchment and pain the ink of truth. Ahio had seen the lines carved on warriors' arms, the burns seared into their shoulders, the patterns of circles and spirals that glowed faintly under firelight. These were not decorations. They were stories only pain could write. The ceremony of burning was spoken of only in fragments. Young men and sometimes women were taken to the center of the village, where a pit fire roared high. A stick was pulled from the coals, its tip glowing like a star. Then, in front of all, the ember was pressed against the skin, long enough to sear a mark, short enough to spare life. The victim did not scream, or rather, was forbidden to. To cry out was to shame one's family, to fail the spirits. Ahio remembered one such night with painful clarity. The boy was no older than she, his chest bare, his eyes fixed on the stars above rather than the burning brand. When the fire touched him, his lips trembled, his fists clenched, but not a sound escaped. The smell of scorched flesh filled the air, thick and metallic, making her throat ache. The crowd cheered softly, not in joy but in solemn approval, as though the boy had crossed a river no one could see. When it was done, the healer smeared herbs over the wound, and the boy walked away, limping, his silence louder than any scream could have been. For weeks after, Ahio could not forget that smell, nor the stillness in his eyes. She wondered if the scar marked him as strong or simply as obedient. Pain, she realized, was not only endured but displayed. A scar was proof of submission to something greater, to tribe, to spirits, to silence itself. The body became a scroll, each wound a line in a story that could never be erased. One night, unable to sleep, she pressed a heated stone briefly to her own arm, testing herself. The sting was sharp, her skin blistering quickly, and she bit down on her lip to silence her gasp. It was only a fraction of what she had seen, and yet the mark stayed with her for weeks, raw and tender. In secret, she traced it with her fingers again and again, as though touching not pain, but initiation. She understood then why so many sought the fire, not for glory, but for the certainty that suffering had meaning, that the silence of flesh was a prayer carved deep enough to last forever. There was a place no one liked to speak of, though all knew it existed. It stood beyond the red tent, beyond even the place where hunters skinned their kills. The tent of isolation. Children whispered of it as if it were cursed, and in some ways it was. It was where the sick were taken when illness lingered too long, when fevers clung like shadows, when coughs rattled the lungs until every breath seemed stolen by invisible hands. Ahio had passed near it only once as a child. The hide walls were darkened by smoke and patched with rough seams. The air around it was heavy with an acrid scent, not only of herbs but of decay. She remembered how her mother had pulled her away sharply, as though her gaze alone might draw sickness into her body. That night, she dreamed of lying inside, her body thin and shaking, while unseen figures pressed against the hides, whispering her name again and again. Now, as an apprentice healer, she could not avoid it. One evening, the elder called her to bring bundles of sage and cedar to the tent. Her hands shook as she lifted the flap and stepped inside. The air was thick and moist, every breath heavy with sweat and smoke. Shapes lay on the ground, wrapped in furs, their faces pale, their lips cracked. Some stared at her with hollow eyes, others muttered to themselves as if arguing with invisible companions. The healer burned herbs until the tent filled with smoke, chanting words that twisted in Ahio's ears. He rubbed salves into trembling limbs, poured bitter teas between lips that barely parted. Some of the sick improved, others did not. When death came, it came quietly, like a candle flame snuffed by a whisper. No wails, no names, only the silent removal of a body in the night, carried beyond the village where no one would step until rains had cleansed the earth. What struck Ahio most was not the illness itself, but the silence around it. No one asked who still lingered inside. No one spoke of those who vanished. The tent was both sanctuary and prison, a place where bodies faded and were erased from memory before death even arrived. She realized then that sickness was the greatest of taboos, not because it was shameful, but because it reminded the living of their own fragility. To name it aloud was to admit it might come for you. That night, as she lay awake, the scent of the tent still clinging to her skin, Ahio wondered if the silence was protection or betrayal. Perhaps both. Perhaps the greatest cruelty was not the fever itself, but the way the sick became shadows long before their breath was gone. Death had always been wrapped in silence, but there were whispers of rituals that carried it deeper, beyond the edge of what could be seen. Ahio had heard fragments of these stories from the older women, murmured late at night in the red tent, when the fire was low and sleep weighed heavy. They spoke of blood not as loss, but as offering, the last gift the body could give when life slipped away. Among her people, the dead were not buried immediately. Their bodies were laid out in the open air, painted with ochre, surrounded by herbs whose smoke rose to the sky. This was the part everyone saw, the part sung about in chants. But there was another part hidden, spoken only in the hush of night. Sometimes the blood of the departed was collected, not left to vanish into the ground. A cut at the wrist, a bowl placed beneath, drops gathered like beads of red stone. Ahio asked once why anyone would do such a thing. The healer's eyes darkened, and he spoke slowly, because the dead carry wisdom in their blood. To taste it is to take their strength. To smear it is to bind their spirit. But it must never be spoken of, for spirits do not forgive those who boast of what is taken. His voice left her trembling. Was this myth, or had his own hands done it before? She dreamed of it that night, a body lying before her, the blood bright and warm in her hands. She lifted it to her lips, and the taste was iron, sharp and burning, yet it filled her with a strange clarity. She woke with her heart pounding, ashamed and unsettled, the taste still imagined on her tongue. For days she could not eat meat without gagging, her mind returning to the image of blood as something both forbidden and holy. Later, she witnessed something that confirmed her fears. A warrior had died suddenly after a hunt, his body strong but his heart seized. As the healer prepared the rites, Ahio saw him draw a small blade, cutting quickly at the wrist. The motion was subtle, shielded by the smoke of cedar, but she saw the red gleam fill a small vessel. No one else noticed. No one spoke. But she knew. From then on, she could not watch the rites of death without wondering what else was hidden in the smoke. Perhaps every farewell was not only a release, but also a taking. The thought chilled her, but it also burned in her veins with a dark fascination. She began to see that death, like blood, was not an end, but an exchange, one that demanded silence, because to admit it was to break the fragile boundary between reverence and hunger. Bones had always been around her, though she had never thought much of them. They littered the edges of the cooking fires after feasts. They clattered in the dust where dogs chewed them to splinters. Children sometimes used them as toys, building small towers or rattles. But Ahio began to notice that bones were more than refuse. In the healer's tent, bones were chosen, handled, and set aside with a care that seemed almost reverent. One evening, while grinding herbs, she watched the healer unwrap a bundle of small bones, ribs, finger joints, delicate bird wings, and lay them in a pattern upon the earth. He murmured to himself as he moved them, as though asking a question. Then he stilled, his eyes closed, his lips unmoving. When he opened them again, he brushed the bones aside quickly, as though nothing had happened. Yet Ahio could feel it. The bones had spoken. Later, she asked him about it. He sighed and shook his head, but finally whispered, "The flesh lies. The breath lies. But bones cannot. They remember everything." He explained no further, yet she understood something essential, that bones were not dead. They were records, vessels, echoes of life pressed into silence. Those who knew how to read them could learn truths hidden from the living. From then on, Ahio watched differently. She saw how certain bones were hung at doorways, bleached in the sun until they glowed white. She noticed how hunters sometimes carved marks into the bones of their kills before leaving them in the forest. She overheard whispers of bones kept secretly beneath sleeping mats, charms against nightmares or illness. The village was filled with bones, but their meanings were spoken only in murmurs. One night, unable to sleep, she crept to the place where the healer kept discarded bones of animals used in rites. She picked up a rib bone, smooth and pale, and held it in her hand. It felt warm, almost alive. She pressed it to her ear, half in foolishness, half in faith. For a moment, only a moment, she thought she heard a faint hum, like the low note of a drum carried far away. She dropped it quickly, heart pounding. That night she dreamed of her own skeleton, glowing faintly beneath her skin, whispering secrets in a voice too soft to understand. There were rumors that haunted Ahio's childhood, stories the elders dismissed with sharp tongues, but that the children repeated in shivers of fascination. Stories of men who had eaten other men. The word was never spoken outright. Instead, it drifted in fragments. They tasted, they fed on, they took strength through the mouth. Always unfinished, always buried under silence before it could become a full confession. As she grew older, she learned that these whispers were not only tales meant to frighten. During times of famine, when the snows stretched long and the game disappeared, there were stories of choices made in the dark. Not every tribe admitted it, but the shadows of the stories lingered. Flesh was flesh, after all. Hunger was a beast with no morals. Yet even when survival demanded it, such acts were never named. To speak of them was to taint not only the one who ate, but the entire village. One winter, a stranger from another band came to their fire, thin as a shadow, his eyes hollow. He was fed, but whispers followed him. Some said his people had starved, that he alone survived, that he had done what none should. No one accused him aloud, but Ahio saw how food was handed to him without touch, how children were called away when he approached. He was not shunned, not exiled, but neither was he ever truly embraced. He lived on the edge, marked forever by a silence heavier than exile. The healer never spoke of it directly, but one evening, as they prepared herbs, he told her, "Every spirit craves return. To take flesh is to bind a spirit to yourself. Sometimes it grants strength. More often, it brings madness." His voice was low, his eyes fixed on the fire. Ahio did not ask him if he had seen it himself, but she knew the answer. That night, she dreamed of tasting human flesh. The dream was vivid, too vivid, the texture on her tongue, the warmth sliding down her throat, the strange, intoxicating rush that followed. She woke trembling, stomach twisting between nausea and hunger. The shame was unbearable, yet the dream clung to her with a weight she could not shake. 4 days, she avoided the fire, avoided meat, avoided even her own reflection in the river. For the first time, she realized that taboos were not only about others. They were about the shadows lurking inside herself. Desire had always lived in silence, moving through the village like smoke, clinging to skin and glances, but never named aloud. Yet Ahio began to learn that desire could also be ritual, that the body itself could be transformed into an offering. She first heard this from the red tent, whispered between older women when the fire was low. They spoke of nights when certain pairs, man and woman, woman and woman, man and man, gave themselves not for pleasure alone, but for the spirits. At first she thought it was jest, one of those half-truths meant to tease the younger ones. But then she began to notice signs. A couple slipping away during a ceremony, returning hours later with eyes glazed and steps unsteady. the faint smell of sage clinging to their skin, as though their intimacy had been blessed or hidden by smoke. These acts were never mentioned, never sung about, but their silence was thick with reverence rather than shame. One night, she dared to ask her mentor, the healer, about it. His face tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a voice that seemed to carry both fear and awe, he replied, "The spirits listen most closely when the body burns with desire. In that fire, a doorway opens. But not every spirit who enters means you well." His eyes turned toward the fire, as if remembering. He would say no more. That warning only deepened Ahio's curiosity. She began to imagine what it meant for bodies to become prayers, for moans to become chants, for sweat to mingle with incense until the air itself was heavy with both flesh and spirit. She thought of the older women, their laughter laced with secrets, and she realized that pleasure itself was not forbidden. It was simply too sacred to be spoken. That night, her dreams grew fevered. She saw herself in the red tent, her body pressed against another's, faceless yet warm, their breath mixing, their skin glowing as if lit from within. Around them, shadows gathered, spirits watching silently. She woke trembling, ashamed, yet filled with a hunger that was both carnal and spiritual. For the first time, she understood that silence could be desire's cloak, and also its altar. There were figures in her people's stories who did not walk as man or woman, but as both, or neither, or something beyond. They were called by many names, but Ahio heard them most often referred to in whispers as those who carry two spirits. As a child, she had thought it was a tale, another trickster myth. But as she grew, she realized they were real, people who lived among the village yet apart, wrapped in silence and paradox. She saw one once, during a gathering with neighboring tribes. The figure was tall, dressed in robes adorned with both men's feathers and women's beads. Their hair was long, braided with red thread, yet their chest was bare, muscles sharp as any warrior's. They moved with a grace that unsettled Ahio, not because it was strange, but because it was whole, as though both paths had fused into one. When they spoke, their voice was low and high at once, carrying the weight of river and wind. The others treated this person with a mixture of awe and unease. Some bowed their heads when they passed, others avoided their gaze entirely. Children were hushed quickly if they asked questions. It was said that those of two spirits were chosen by the divine, able to see truths the rest could not. They were healers, dreamers, sometimes lovers to those who sought visions in the dark. Yet their existence was also dangerous, for they blurred the lines the tribe depended on. The healer once told Ahio that such people carried both the sun and the moon inside their chest. "It makes them powerful," he said, "but it also makes them lonely. Few can touch them without fear of being burned." Ahio thought of that often, especially when she caught her own reflection in the river and wondered if she, too, carried something doubled inside her. That night, she dreamed of walking with the two-spirit figure through a forest lit by blue fireflies. They whispered in her ear words she could not remember upon waking, but their presence lingered, heavy as smoke. She awoke with the strange certainty that she had been marked, though she did not know by what. In the silence of the dawn, she realized that the greatest taboos were not always forbidden acts. Sometimes they were lives lived openly, too immense for words, and so wrapped forever in silence. It began with the drums. Slow, steady, distant at first, then rising like a heartbeat too large for any single chest. The entire village gathered, not in joy or mourning, but in solemnity. This was the night of the great silence, a time when no words were spoken from dusk until dawn. Ahio had waited for it all her life, though she had never understood its meaning. As the sun slipped behind the horizon, fires were lit, their smoke rising like dark rivers into the sky. Children clung to their mothers, confused by the command not to speak. Men sat with spears across their knees, their gazes far away. Women braided each other's hair, fingers moving in ritual patterns. No one gave instruction. No one explained. The silence itself was the ceremony. At first, Ahio felt restless. Every sound seemed louder, the crackle of wood, the cough of a child, the rustle of furs. But as the hours passed, something shifted. The silence deepened, not empty but full, as though the air itself was listening. She began to feel her own body differently, her breath loud in her chest, her heart steady and fragile, her skin prickling with awareness. It was as if every secret she had ever carried was now standing beside her, visible but wordless. The elders sat with their eyes closed, their faces calm, their bodies swaying slightly with the rhythm of the drums. Ahio followed their lead, closing her eyes. In the silence she heard not absence, but layers, whispers of ancestors, echoes of laughter, the sigh of lovers, the weeping of the sick. All of it lived inside the quiet. She understood then that silence was not meant to hide, it was meant to hold. By dawn, when the first birds sang, no one rushed to speak. The voices returned slowly, carefully, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. Ahio kept her silence longer, savoring it like a taste on her tongue. She knew now that the great silence was not about forbidding speech. It was about remembering that beneath all words, all secrets, all taboos, there was a deeper voice, the voice of what could never be spoken, yet was always present. There was a story the elders never told, but that Ahio had heard in fragments, of a place hidden in the forest where mirrors were made not of glass, but of polished obsidian. They were said to be used only once in a lifetime, during a final rite of passage. When she asked the healer about it, he only said, "One day you will see yourself." That day came after the great silence. At dawn, she was led with others her age into the forest, far from the village. The air was damp, filled with the scent of pine and earth. At last they reached a clearing where a circle of dark stones stood upright, each polished to a dull reflective sheen. They were not perfect mirrors, but they caught enough light to show distorted faces. Ahio felt her heart tighten. Each youth was told to stand before a stone and gaze until the sun rose fully. No one spoke, not even the elders. Ahio stood before her mirror and saw at first only herself, tired and thin, her eyes shadowed by restless nights. But as the sky lightened, her reflection began to shift. She saw herself painted in blood, standing in the red tent. She saw herself scarred, hanging from cords in a ritual of pain. She saw herself in the arms of lovers, faceless but familiar. She saw herself old, carrying bones in her hands, whispering chants. Tears stung her eyes, but she did not look away. The mirror showed not one self, but many, overlapping like layers of smoke. Each was her, each was true, each carried a taboo she had once feared. She realized then that the taboos were not walls to keep her small, but mirrors to show her what she was made of. They were the shadows of her own reflection, waiting for her to claim them. When the sun rose high enough to blind the stone, her reflection dissolved into light. She stepped back, her body trembling, her chest full as though she had swallowed the river itself. No elder explained what she had seen. None needed to. The silence of the others was enough. Each carried their own reflection now, their own unspoken truth. Walking back toward the village, Ahio felt lighter, though not free of the weight of silence. Instead, she carried it differently, not as a burden, but as a companion. For the first time, she understood that to live was to walk among taboos, not in fear, but in reverence. The silence was no longer a prison. It was her inheritance. When Ahio returned from the circle of mirrors, the village felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had. She noticed now how silence wove itself into everything. The men sharpening spears before the hunt, their faces unreadable. The women weaving patterns into cloth, their mouths closed but their fingers speaking. Even the children carried it, learning quickly which questions never to ask, which names never to repeat. For the first time, Ahio understood that silence was not merely the rule of the elders. It was an inheritance, passed like fire from one generation to the next. Each child learned to carry it, not fully knowing why, but sensing the danger of breaking it. It was not the words themselves that mattered, but the spaces left unsaid, the agreements made without voice. Her grandmother once told her, "We survive because we remember, and we remember by keeping quiet." At the time, Ahio had thought it cruel, even cowardly. Now she saw its truth. To keep a silence was to hold something precious without crushing it. To break it carelessly was to scatter something too fragile to recover. She thought of all the taboos she had witnessed, the red tent, the forbidden names, the rites of hunger and pain, the secrets of flesh and blood. Each had seemed separate, but now she saw they were threads of the same cloth. They kept the people together, not by law or force, but by silence. The unspoken was what bound them most tightly. That night, she sat by the river again, listening to its endless murmur. She no longer strained to catch words within it. She let the sound wash over her, endless and patient. The river carried silences too, carrying them farther than words could travel. For the first time, she felt not curiosity, but belonging. The inheritance was heavy, but it was also hers to carry. It was said that the ancestors spoke in dreams, but Ahio began to notice them in waking moments too. In the crackle of the fire, in the rustle of leaves, in the sudden stillness before a storm. They were not voices in the way of speech, but presences pressing against the skin, filling the air like breath. One evening, As the fire burned low, she sat alone outside her tent. The smoke curled upward, and in it she saw shapes, faces she half recognized, eyes that seemed both kind and stern. For a moment, she thought she heard her grandmother's voice, not speaking words but humming a rhythm that had lulled her to sleep as a child. It carried her back instantly, as though time itself had folded. The red tent women said that blood tied the living to the dead, but Ahio felt it was silence that bound them closer. Each time she held back a word, she felt the ancestors stir, as though nodding in approval. They did not want to be named, but remembered in shadows, in gestures, in the way one carried themselves through life. To break the silence would be to strip them of dignity, to drag them back when they had earned their rest. That night she dreamed vividly. She walked through a forest lit only by stars, the trees alive with whispers. The voices of her people stretched behind her, not only the living but countless generations, each carrying their own silences. She felt them press against her back, steadying her steps, reminding her that she was not alone. The weight was great, but so was the strength. When she woke, tears wet her cheeks, but she was not afraid. For the first time, she did not feel like a girl peering into mysteries too heavy for her. She felt like a link in a chain, one that stretched behind her into shadows, and ahead into futures she could not yet see. The ancestors were not gone. They were breathing through her silence, speaking most clearly in what she did not say. By now, Ahio understood that every silence had a guardian. The red tent women guarded the mysteries of blood, the warriors guarded the scars of pain, the healer guarded the forbidden herbs and chants. Even the children guarded their own, whispering to each other the fragments they were not supposed to know. But in the end, each person was the keeper of their own secrets, carrying them quietly, like stones hidden in the folds of cloth. She began to notice how the village breathed in this rhythm. Conversations ended abruptly when children drew too near. Eyes averted themselves when glances lingered too long. Even laughter sometimes held a shade of restraint, as if joy itself risked revealing too much. At first, this realization made Ahio restless, as though she were trapped in a place where no one ever spoke freely. But then she began to see the beauty of it, the way silence allowed space for mystery, the way it kept life deep rather than shallow. One evening, the healer took her aside and said, "You have seen much. Too much, perhaps. But remember, not every secret is meant to be broken. Some are meant to be kept, even from yourself." His words lingered, strange and heavy. She wondered if that was what it meant to grow, not to speak all truths, but to learn which ones deserved silence. That night, Ahio sat by the fire and thought of all she had witnessed. The unspoken names of the dead, the hunger that hollowed the body, the fire that carved scars into flesh, the lovers who hid in shadows, the two spirits who walked between worlds. She realized that she was now a keeper too, her body and memory holding fragments no child should ever know. She felt the weight, but also a strange pride. Secrets were not chains. They were roots. In silence, she touched her chest, feeling her heart steady beneath her palm. It beat like a drum, like a hidden chant. Perhaps every heart was a secret too, carrying rhythms no one else could hear. She smiled faintly. To keep such things safe was not a burden, but an honor. It was on a night of heavy clouds, when the moon was hidden, that Ahio felt something shift inside her. She had grown used to listening, to the river, to the healer's chants, to the laughter in the red tent, to the silence of the sick. But that night, she realized she had been waiting too long for voices outside. The truest one was within. She lay alone in her tent, the air thick with the scent of smoke and rain. Her breath was steady, her body warm, yet her mind restless. Closing her eyes, she let the silence fill her ears. At first it was only emptiness. Then slowly she began to hear something softer, deeper, a hum that seemed to rise from her own chest. It was not words, not song, but a vibration, a presence. She realized it had been there all along, quiet, waiting. In that moment, she felt every taboo she had carried fold inward. They were not things outside her, rules imposed by others. They were inside her body, her blood, her breath. She felt the hunger of her own stomach, the scars she had touched on others, the shame of her forbidden dreams, the heat of desire, the tremor of fear at the breath of the dead. None of it was foreign. None of it was alien. It was all her. Tears slid down her cheeks as she lay still, trembling not with fear but with release. She understood now that silence was not emptiness. It was the voice of the self before it was divided into words, before it was judged or hidden. It was the place where all things began, where the ancestors still whispered, where the body spoke without sound. When she finally opened her eyes, the tent was dark, but she no longer felt alone. The silence was not around her. It was her. She breathed slowly, deeply, as if drinking in the night. For the first time, she did not fear what was hidden. She welcomed it because she understood the voice within her silence was enough. The night was cool, the sky vast, and the stars hung low as though they had bent closer to listen. Ahio walked alone to the river, the same river that had once frightened her with its whispers. Now its murmur felt familiar, almost tender. She knelt by the bank, her reflection rippling in the dark water, and she saw not the frightened girl she had once been, but a woman woven of silence, scars, and shadows. She thought of everything she had witnessed. The red tent with its blood and laughter, the unspoken names that floated like ghosts in her throat, the hunger that hollowed, the fire that scarred, the bones that whispered, the flesh that must never be named. She thought of the two spirits who walked between worlds, and of the ancestors breathing through the gaps in every word. All of it came to her now, not as fragments, but as a single thread, weaving through her body like the current of the river. The taboos no longer felt like cages. They were doors, not to be opened, but to be honored, standing silently at the thresholds of life. Some she had crossed, some she never would, but each had shown her a face of herself. The forbidden was not the enemy. It was the shape of the invisible, teaching her to listen where there were no words. She closed her eyes and let the silence press against her skin. The river's breath, the wind's touch, the night's embrace, all of it folded into her. For the first time, she did not yearn to know, to break, to uncover. She was content simply to be carried, like a name whispered into water, like a secret too vast for words. When she opened her eyes again, the horizon was soft with the first light of dawn. The village slept behind her. The river glimmered ahead, endless and calm. Ahio breathed deeply, and the silence within her answered. She smiled faintly, as if she had heard the last secret, the one that could never be spoken, and accepted it.